So I'm very pleased to be able to introduce to you the distinguished members of the roundtable. So first, from the Institute for Creative and Cultural Entrepreneurship at Goldsmiths, University of London, Carla Figueria. Next we have Kingsley Edney from Leeds, Ed Wastnidge from Open University, and Illya Yablokov, also of Leeds University. And we're going to run this roundtable in a slightly different format than usual. So the presenters, the panelists, they're not presenting papers. I have a series of questions for them, and it's going to be our AirSats version of question time. So I'm going to pose questions to the panelists. They're going to give their answers. But at any point, we're very keen for members of the audience to stick up their hands and make their own comments or ask their own questions. So I'll be keeping a speakers list as we go on. Okay? Excellent. So the first question that we have, or I have for our panelists, is what roles does soft power or cultural diplomacy play in your own research and the questions that you're attempting to answer? So Carla, would you be willing to kick it off?
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, it's a pleasure being here, and I'm glad that our soft power was greater than the soft power of the beach and the sun outside, and to see many of you here. In a way, I'm sort of an outsider, so I didn't participate in the Soft Power of Hard States publication, and Michael invited me to come here because the work I do is mainly in the area of cultural policy, relations, and diplomacy. So this is kind of my day in and out. So for me, in terms of soft power and cultural diplomacy, what questions am I trying to answer? First of all, I'm trying to understand the connections between cultural policy and foreign policy, so cultural diplomacy. However, I have problems with the terminology and the frameworks in this area, and I'm sure many of us that work in this area have similar problems. And I'm slowly, in a way, moving away from these more traditional terms and forms of approaching the area, so traditional cultural diplomacy, and really trying to engage more and more with the practice of civil society and really how they are enacting change in this area and trying to understand that. Although, to be honest, for the moment, a lot of the research I do is understanding in terms of policies, how these terms, for example, are used, to express particular policy directions.
Thank you. Kingsley.
Thanks, Carl. Well, my interests mainly lie in politics and international relations of China, and I'm particularly interested in this problem of how the Communist Party, the leaders of the authorities in China, how they deal with this issue of being an authoritarian state in a world that is dominated by sort of liberal democratic values, essentially, and how they manage that problem of globalizing, or continuing to be open to the world, and to open up and try to gain the advantages of globalization of information and ideas that goes on, while remaining, I guess, ideologically secure in their position as an authoritarian state. And so, for me, soft power is interesting because, not so much because I think it's a useful analytical tool, because I don't really use it as an analytical tool to understand Chinese foreign relations, but what I do is I use it as a way to look at how the authorities in China use this term soft power and what that indicates about what they care about, what they're insecure about, how they understand power and international relations, and therefore think about the implications of that for China's relations with the rest of the world. So I don't go around measuring soft power or trying to see if China's soft power is increasing or decreasing. I look at how the concept of soft power is interpreted in China and what that tells us about how Chinese policymakers might think about security and international relations in a slightly different way than we think about it in Western countries.
Thank you. Eddie.
Hi, well, my research looks at foreign policy of Iran, and the thing that's interesting for me is that, really, I'm interested in questions of identity and international relations and foreign policy and how that might inform a country's foreign policy. I'm also interested in how sort of big ideas get translated into foreign policy discourses. So what's quite interesting for me with soft power is how we have this kind of idea that's born in the academic world and then how it suddenly finds a home in policy circles. So there's this kind of practical application there. But I'm very interested in questions of identity, particularly with Iran, because we have a country here with two prominent strands of identity that it's trying to articulate through different kind of soft power tools. So on the one hand, we have this idea of sort of civilizational grandeur and being a great civilization, which has kind of pre-Islamic reference points as well, and that therefore informs its cultural diplomacy subsequently. And then we also have a strong Islamist current as well, with it being the world's only theocracy, as it were. So they're kind of two interesting strands of identity that are articulated through soft power discourses, and they also tell us something about the political structure of Iran as well, because there's a dualism that exists in the internal power structure of Iran. So yeah, it's just looking at how those ideas are kind of articulated on the world stage primarily.
Thank you.
Illya. I don't know which microphone to use. So basically, the starting point for my research was to look at how conspiracy theories are working in the public space. But I was looking initially at the Russian domestic scene, and I was looking at conspiracy theories as a kind of tool of kind of delegitimation and relocation of power between different political actors. So when I was doing my research, my PhD research on Russia, I was constantly coming across different articles on Russia Today. There's kind of a tool for crackpots, etc., etc., etc. So this sort of articles are kind of still popular in the media sphere, in the journalistic world. And then, kind of when I look closer at the content of Russia Today, it's kind of became pretty obvious that the ways how conspiracy theories are used on the domestic market, on the domestic political market, in the same way they're used on the global political market. Just the audiences are different and the messages are also different. So then, if you look at the connection between the usage of kind of anti-Westernism and anti-Americanism in the Russian politics, and then if you look at what kind of messages, what kind of topics are being discussed at the programs or on RT, then you'll see that there's a kind of a direct connection, and that's why I'm kind of interested in how these ideas, how the transfer of ideas is happening between the, say, domestic market and the kind of global market, how these audiences can be connected, and basically what are the kind of to what extent maybe we can talk about conspiracy theories as a political tool, not as something weird or anything like that. So.
Fantastic. And so I've got a follow-up, and I'll start with you, Illya.
Yeah.
Get a drink of water first. And it relates to, are there specific methodological challenges of studying soft power, or in your case, conspiracy theories? And if so, what are they?
Certainly, there is a kind of there is a basic methodological problem of how you define conspiracy theories and how you kind of avoid these paranoid brands. So in that sense, I'm relying on the corpus of research from the United States, where the tradition of studying conspiracy theories is vast and very useful in order to understand how it actually works. So first, I looked at what conspiracy theories are. So here we need to kind of divide kind of the real existing conspiracy and non-conspiracy theories, because conspiracy theory is something, it's the key word here is a theory, right? So it's something, it's an assumption, it's not the fact, which kind of divides it from kind of real existing conspiracy theories. Some of them can actually evolve into real conspiracies when, these kind of agreements, secret agreements are being exposed by the journalists or by politicians, whatever. But what is important about knowing about conspiracy theories, there's few elements, right? There's always secret plot. The goal is always kind of to get the power, and this goal is always has negative consequences to different audiences or to the society in general. So kind of starting with this premise, we look at how these notions are used in public space in order to undermine certain political actors or maybe communities, for example. And what is important about this kind of methodological framework is that it looks at conspiracy theories not as something marginal, but as an absolutely legitimate tool of political struggles. And hence, if you look at kind of soft power, kind of one of the definitions, certainly they could be challenged and just kind of debated, right? But if you take at least one of them, is the way of engaging with different audiences, global audiences, then we see that if we have a certain actor like Russia as an underdog, who tries to kind of delegitimize actions of other global powers, then we'll see that these kind of messages can actually undermine certain political attempts on the part of the United States during the Ukrainian crisis to undermine their message. And here, I think the same kind of framework elaborated by American political scientists can be applied to the study of soft power.
Great. And Eddie, specific challenges for you?
I guess, I mean, on a very, very practical level, just in terms of conducting research to start with, it is gaining access to the kind of levers of soft power in Iran itself for myself, because, I mean, I've been fortunate enough to conduct research in Iran and gain access to Persian language sources and things out there, but it's problematic for a British person at the moment to go out there visa-wise, so that's just a very practical thing, which means that I can still engage with the discourse as much as possible and gain as much as I can from what's online and from colleagues out there, but it's difficult for me to, you need to get out there, I think, and speak to different kind of stakeholders, the people who are in charge of promoting Iran's cultural diplomacy, for example. So that's a very kind of practical issue. I think the other thing is as well, I mean, for me as someone who's not really much of a theorist, and comes from a kind of an area studies background, is that there's a tendency to, I've seen in lots of literature anyway, to take soft power face value and take a very kind of thin veneer of it and apply it to one's work as well, which is to say something about how useful it is as a kind of analytical tool, because many people have taken it in that way. But then, I think it means that you are perhaps, it's difficult to explain, but if you look at the ways in which, a country like Iran has taken the soft power discourse and applied it in its foreign policy, then, you are in a danger of basically just repeating that. So if it's very empirically based work, you're just going to be kind of regurgitating what's already out there and what use is that. So that's why I think it's quite useful when there's some more kind of critical takes on soft power that you can then apply. I think that's very helpful, and it was certainly helpful for me in my own research. Doing this is a very constructive endeavour in that regard. So yeah, there's two minor ones.
Great, Kingsley.
Yeah, I mean, my research is very much based on looking at the discourse in sort of academic and policy circles in China. So I think that's reasonably straightforward. It's I think the problems with a lot of soft power research is that it's very easy to study the kind of the inputs and the policies and the resources or the money that's going into it. It's very hard to study the results or look at outcomes and measure them in any meaningful way. And often that kind of falls back on looking at opinion polls, like sort of public opinion surveys, like the sort of the Pew surveys and these kinds of world, what do you think of this country, or what this country's policies kind of surveys, which I think it's fine. But the problem I think with that is that it doesn't really sort of differentiate between different kinds of audiences. It just is like, well, here are all these people in this country, the public. That may be one target audience for this country's public diplomacy policy, but it doesn't really help to pick out what about the elites within that country who may be more important in terms of their attraction to the country, or they may be being targeted by specific public diplomacy or cultural diplomacy policies, or exchange programs and these kinds of things. And those sort of large-scale opinion polls don't really help us to understand how audiences break down within countries, and who matters more, possibly more than others. There's a big distinction, I think, in China's case between in a country like the UK or the US, the local overseas Chinese population is a different audience for China's soft power, very different audience than sort of the indigenous sort of population, or the broader kind of community in those countries. And so looking at automatic, that's already a really big distinction there in terms of the audience and how they receive particular messages that isn't really measured by the kind of polling that we have access to.
Great. Carla.
As my colleagues, I face a multiplicity of challenges, particularly that I work across different disciplines. So international relations, which is my background, but then also cultural policy, at times cultural studies, at times social linguistics. And I do mix that in my work. In terms of area, I study a lot, obviously, Lusophone countries, because I'm originally from Portugal. And just picking up on some of the points the members of the panel were pointing to. So the issue of definition, what is soft power? What is cultural diplomacy? So it's so important, and you have very contradictory definitions of what it is. Is it about mutual understanding? Is it to put your message out there as propaganda? Has to do with the state, has to do with civil society, all the limits of what defines cultural diplomacy and soft power. So it is very vague, it is very fluid, and depending on the authors you're looking at, you will find quite diverse definitions. So that is a challenge you have to face, because it's not a stable term, which poses many challenges. It has also, been alluded, and I find it's quite important aspect of impact and how to evaluate that impact. What sort of audiences are you reaching? And that is really difficult to ascertain. In some of the institutions I look at, for example, the British Council and very recently the Goethe Institute are now developing ways of trying to measure the impact of the activities they have. And so the one from the Goethe Institute is actually quite recent. I think they released this new concept last month. So these are new developments. Obviously in kind of one of the main areas I work, which is cultural policy, where culture has to show in terms of the policymakers what is the value, of them invest in terms of public policy in the area of culture. And this obviously reflects in the area of cultural diplomacy and soft power. So is it a Mickey Mouse policy, cultural diplomacy, or is it something really important that is at the basis of international policies? So there are kind of a myriad of challenges that have been pointed out, and I do face them in different aspects of my work. Particularly, I think, because they are also, the areas I work are new, areas are not stable academic disciplines, such as cultural policy, for example. So because they don't have that long tradition of theories and definitions, often it is difficult to find a theoretical home, a methodological home, and you have to be flexible depending on the work you do.
Great. I mean, one of the things that seems to be uniting answers here is that question of conceptualization and the kinds of challenges that poses. So what I wanted to do was ask you, Eddy, in terms of, with your own work, what's been important recent developments in the literature on soft power, on cultural diplomacy, that's kind of helped you to navigate those waters?
Well, I mean, the first one, it's not exactly recent actually, was Merton's work from 2004, 2005, which was about representational force, and I thought that was a very useful, way of articulating how soft power and hard power, are not necessarily mutually exclusive, and that there is some coercion that sometimes that sometimes exists within soft power as well. But I think one of the most useful things, and something that's started to inform my research more, is the work by Ms. Guimond and others, and O'Loughlin and Russell, about strategic narratives. I think that's been very useful, especially when looking at Iran, because looking at how it tries to articulate, its position on the world stage, which kind of narrative it's putting forward. It's very much, the kind of counter-hegemonic discourse, sort of anti-imperial kind of discourse that it's promoting. So, and it does that through still drawing on some kind of cultural levers, kind of cultural reference points, should I say, as well. The strategic narratives and how that relates to soft power as well is been really useful for me. I'd say, and then there's some interesting links. I mean, having looked at Illya's and Kingsley's papers as well. What Illya mentions about the kind of information monopoly that's talked about in RT's programming or their ideas behind their work. I think there's a strong parallel with the kind of international broadcast media that Iran has as well, through press TV and that kind of thing as well, and it does certainly veer towards conspiracy theories as well. So ways of projecting different narratives are really interesting. I think the kind of strategic narrative discourse has been one that's quite recent. I mean, it's 2014, I think. The paper came out in relation to soft power, and it's well worth taking a look at, definitely.
Great. And Carla, given that you're juggling several different worlds and trying to answer these questions.
Well, actually, it's a similar answer. The most recent, it is the strategic narratives, but I think it is useful to think of different potential approaches, even from Bourdieu in terms of cultural capital of a country, and try to think, the more traditional concept of hegemony, still maintain all these concepts and theories available for us to use, but in terms of the most recent, it is the strategic narratives too.
Great. Illya?
Well, since I'm sort of coming from slightly different area, just like Ed, so I would say that quite an interesting idea maybe, which actually appeared even in the foreign policy agenda of the UK, is the idea of this information warfare. And the ways how we should actually treat, different engagements, both by individuals, if you're talking about hackers, for example, or by the state, by, channeling different ideas through, for example, through websites, or again, through the trolls. I would say that this is something which recently helps us to kind of, to reconsider to what extent soft can actually be coercive or even hard, and at the same time it kind of helps us look at even non-state entities such as the ISIS, for example, can also engage in various kinds of let's say soft power or public diplomacy activities, as they do. They did, for example, a couple of years ago. I know there's a very interesting project at the Open University by Mary Gillespie, who's doing the analysis of the IC output. So I think that kind of looking at these very specific fields, let's say RT and authoritarian states applying that, I think the idea of information warfare would be something worth just kind of exploring too.
Kingsley.
I think that the strategic narratives paper is really interesting and potentially could be applied to China, I suppose. But I find that when I look at soft power in the Chinese context, I need to have a fairly open mind, because I'm always being surprised at the ways that it is applied in China by academics or policy people. It seems to pop up everywhere. And, if you sort of say, well, this is what soft power is, and then it's like, well, hold on, why are they using it to talk about this, for example? So it's, so I find that it's not, I don't tend to be looking for the, to kind of conceptualize soft power in those ways. So I try to sort of see what emerges from the discourse in China, and it's a lot of it is to do with power competition between China and the US and domestic security issues. And I mean, I've even heard or read an article where a Chinese scholar was talking about needing to increase, or talking about the soft power of socialist ideology, and presumably within China. So like the domestic attractiveness of this ideology to Chinese people within China, not necessarily to foreign audiences at all. So being applied in domestic politics, I think, is one interesting kind of variation that we see in China's case. I think it's potentially useful in a state where it is, there are these kind of peripheral areas. There are sort of the cultural periphery in terms of Tibet and Xinjiang and Hong Kong and Taiwan, that that kind of concept of soft power could be applied to sort of attracting them to the core the core values and the core interests and goals of the centre of Beijing. So I tend to try to maintain an open mind on what soft power means, I guess.
So if we look at the panel, we've got the Lusophone, we've got China, we've got Iran, we have Russia. Thinking a little bit about what the particular challenges are for the cases that you look at, the national cases, in terms of the application of soft power, the ways in which they try and use it. I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit. So starting with you, Kingsley, and Chinese soft power and challenges you see for the Chinese state.
Well, I think that, the most obvious one is that sort of external challenge of how do you make, if we go back to Nye's definition of soft power, a big part of it is political values. How do you make the political values of an authoritarian state appealing in Western countries? What could be admirable or attractive about that to a Western audience? Of course, that's not the whole audience, because if we look at more globally, there are many more sort of audiences around the world that may care less about these issues, but that's the obvious big barrier. But I think internally as well within China, there is also the challenge of cultural production, creativity, innovation, cultural competition, producing and exporting cultural products in a domestic political environment that is, especially in the last few years, becoming more and more controlled and repressive. And the political chill in China at the moment is very serious and is affecting, I guess, artists, journalists, academics, and all kinds of people who could potentially be putting out ideas and sort of projecting Chinese ideas out into the world that are just there's no incentive for them to take any kind of risk or to innovate at all at the moment when there is such a strong political chill in place. So I think, that's always been an issue for China, in that how do you balance those needs of making sure that the message that you're sending is consistent with the party line, but also making it appealing and interesting to the audience. And that's always been a problem, but I think in the current climate, it's even more apparent. And so I think for me, where I think we're more likely to see China sort of take steps forward in terms of its soft power are in the sort of the top-down, state-led policy areas, like the sort of the institution building that we're seeing China doing, setting up new institutions and trying to sort of set the agenda and push forward these sort of big narratives about things like internet sovereignty and different sort of pushing forward these sort of top-down sort of normative ideas about international politics, rather than in the cultural sphere, where there is this kind of this sort of crackdown in place at the moment.
Illya, in relation to the Russian state.
Well, that's actually quite an interesting question, because if we look at, say, these 10 years from 2005, since the moment when RC was established, to roughly 2015 and 2016, we'll see that there's an evolution going on here. Because initially the outlet was established as a tool to sell a very nice picture of Russia as a kind of culture, a country with a great culture and quite with a European outlook in a way. And then if you look at 2014 at the opening of the Sochi Olympic Games, that was just another example of how kind of the Russian government and kind of pro-state media try to portray Russia as a very kind of democratic and westernized in a way country. It's not the kind of outskirts of Europe, it's a proper country, proper power. And then this is connected to one major strength, kind of the overcoming of the Cold War legacy, kind of showing it's not the evil empire anymore, it's a valid and legitimate political actor. And on the other hand, there's another thing, quite a contrary to that, which is kind of defending itself, defending its policies, as opposed to the criticism of other legitimate actors like the United States, the EU, etc., etc. So, and these kind of trends sometimes overlap, sometimes go in parallel, sometimes clash and cause conflicts. And that's why I think this is very interesting to see again, it's an important example of how the state in transition from kind of socialism to democracy kind of tries to sell itself, tries to sell its progress, and in a way shows both strengths and the weaknesses of that progress. So that's another interesting thing.
And Carla, in terms of the Lusophone, I guess part of the issue would be who's the metropole and where's the periphery. But in terms of developments, what have you noticed recently?
It's a very interesting case because obviously you have the old colonial master that does not have much money, but still feels that, you know, the power is still enshrined in the spread of language and maybe some sharing of culture. And Portugal has invested quite a lot in, you know, the meager means it has in terms of trying to boost Lusophony as a concept, particularly through its institutionalized form, which is the Community of Portuguese Language Countries that has its headquarters in Lisbon. And it's interesting to see that, you know, for most of its existence, now it's going to be its 20th anniversary, I think, this year. It's been seen as an organization that doesn't really do much, you know, it's just a symbol. However, in terms, for example, quite recently of cultural policy, they have tried, you know, little steps of really trying to organize together some strategic actions, try to develop some common policy. And I think there may be a way forward in that sense. So no longer a cultural diplomacy that is only based on a national narrative, but one that is common to a certain cultural linguistic area or space. So I think that's interesting to observe, not just in the case of the Lusophony, potentially in the case of Francophony. So in these kind of types of spaces, of course, within Lusophony, you have the case of Brazil, that has not devoted much attention to traditional cultural diplomacy, so it has not followed the model of the National Cultural Institute that much as, you know, as the case, for example, of Portugal, and that really relied on the commercial culture to do the promotion, to do the talking through culture to the world. So there's really a variety of practices in terms of cultural diplomacy within the Lusophone world that are quite interesting. And in the cases of the African countries, which is also interesting, where it permeates the domestic and international boundaries, where cultural diplomacy may also be used in a way to sustain their narrative of nation building, you know, within their regional areas. So there's really a variety of practices and policies being developed at the moment.
Great, thank you. Now, Eddie, your case is interesting insofar as there have been recent developments with the ending of the sanctions regime. Do you have a sense, is this any kind of relation to things that Iran had been doing in terms of cultural diplomacy and soft power, or is this a completely separate kettle of fish?
I think it's probably separate. I think there'll be elements within Iran that would, you know, perhaps more pragmatic elements that would say, look, you know, the kind of cultural diplomacy that we've enacted and the soft power ideas that we've had have shown that we are a rational actor on the world stage and that we can be trusted and you know, look what we have to offer kind of thing. But I think ultimately it comes down to sort of more kind of traditional high-level sort of diplomacy based on kind of strategic interest and wanting to, you know, kind of well, on the West, you know, from the Western view, bring Iran to heel, but from the Iranian view, to maintain its kind of rights that it sees it, you know, has. So I don't know whether the current changes in Iran's, well, the seeming changes in Iran's international position are necessarily related to it, but it may well have you know, a positive effect, you know, going on from this point. So, for example, Press TV, which is Iran's international English language rolling news channel, been banned in the UK since 2009 because of alleged complicity in broadcasting forced confessions following the 2009 election protests there. So it may be that, you know, it regains its position as to be able to broadcast here. The difficult thing Iran faces at the moment is because of the rising sectarian tension, or certainly this narrative that there are sectarian tensions in the Middle East. Now Iran sees itself, as the kind of centre of Shia learning and of Shia power in the world, and so this is potentially going to create problems for it if it tries to have a more assertive, line in terms of, cultural diplomacy towards, Shia communities in Sunni majority states. So hopefully once those kind of sectarian tensions die down, if they indeed do, then it may well have a strong hand to play. But at the moment it kind of can cause it some problems, particularly with Saudi Arabia and potentially with Pakistan as well. I mean, the other interesting thing as well is, in terms of developments, is how active Iranian politicians have been in the Twitter sphere, so and how they've used these kind of different media ecologies, social media, to kind of get their points across and to explain their ideas and narratives. So that's something that's quite important to them. But the irony is that these are channels that are officially banned within Iran itself, but they appreciate the value and use of them in kind of projecting ideas to the world. Yeah.
Excellent. So in the little time that we have remaining, what I wanted to put to the panel was, what are the futures of soft power and cultural diplomacy if we're looking forward? Is it something, for example, as Illya suggested, that we're seeing the rise of things like information war or hybrid warfare? Is it a more benign and happy sort of future where, it's increased cultural communication and dialogue? Or is it somewhere in between?
Or just both.
Or both, yes. Illya, do you want to?
Well, I think that, do not misunderstand my point of view. I think that we are going to see many different trends with both kind of soft power, more elements and more new tools will pop up. First of all, with regards to the social media aspect of it, and I think this is where kind of the most promising aspect of it, how kind of nice and kind of peaceful ideas will be transferred through the new means of communication, and at the same time how certain reactions, maybe aggressive reactions, will be wrapped up and maybe sold through the social media again. So I think this is one of the interesting aspects which we are going to see in the coming decades. And it's not only going to be warfare, it's going to be also nice and peaceful things.
Carla?
As Illya had said in the beginning, I think it's the empowerment of the non-state actors, particularly of individuals, again in connection with social media, that's where we're going to see the major developments in terms of soft power. Because seeing it from the point of view where I usually work, what is not soft power? At times I ask myself, because everything is soft power.
Yeah.
And I find quite interesting is also the appropriation of that word, either soft power or cultural diplomacy, by actors that, traditionally I wouldn't say that they are, diplomatic actors.
Mm-hmm.
But, again, it all depends on how you view the area, and because it's so open to this interpretation, and maybe that is the way forward, is this multiplicity and complexity, and then this, for us, is the challenge of trying to navigate that.
Kingsley?
Going back nearly 10 years, or starting from around 10 years ago, the Chinese leaders have basically been saying openly that the cultural component of international power competition is becoming more important, more significant. And so they've just been consistently saying that we need to focus more attention on culture as an aspect of power competition between China and other countries. And so that is not going away. I think what's interesting to look for is to see whether that balance lies between the sort of the defensive side of it and the more kind of proactive, I don't want to say offensive, but more the sort of the proactive going out aspect of it compared to the what I would call ideological security aspect of it, and defending ourselves against threatening foreign ideas at home versus actually going out and telling our story to the world. Of course, you can do those both at the same time, and they're interconnected. But I see that it seems at the moment that China's very much focused on the defensive side of things, and the securing of the kind of ideological environment at home is more important than the selling our story to the world aspect.
Last word to you, Eddie.
Oh, okay. Well, I think I certainly agree with the three comments we've had on that question. In Iran's case, I think the defensive element, very similar to China, is key as well. And there's been this kind of narrative of soft war, which is prominent in Iran at the moment, and that is all about kind of cyber warfare as well, and defending against cultural penetration from the West. And this is what Carla said as well about different actors being involved that aren't necessarily normally involved in soft power cultural diplomacy. We had one of the leaders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps saying we must protect ourselves against a cultural NATO, whatever that is. So there's kind of mixing these ideas in and bringing them into kind of almost hard power type strategies. But we use the kind of tools of soft power as in social networks, social media, the internet, that kind of thing. It shows us the difficulty of conceptualizing it, because we're looking at so many different terms here. I'm bandying them around myself, and not necessarily always clear either. But I think, we're definitely, I think we'll see state. We're looking at just authoritarian states as we are here. I think the defensive element seems to be quite strong, and it's kind of running against the kind of Western-led narratives. I would say, yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I can hear from the crowd outside that our time is up, but I would like to thank the distinguished members of the panel for coming here today and talking about their work, and I'd really like to thank you as an audience for sacrificing a lunch hour and coming and listening to us. Just two quick plugs before we go. One is that the special issue that we talked about at the beginning is available at politicsjournal.com, and it's freely available, Rosie, for how long? Until the end of March. So go on, download it, distribute it to friends, get it out there. And the other thing is you can read extended abstracts of many of these papers on our blog, which is politicsblog.ac.uk. Thank you all very much, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much.